Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Goblins and Growlers Podcast. I'm Josh Maltby at Black Cloak DM on Discord and Blue Sky.
I'm Brandon Dingus at Wave Brandalore on Discord and Instagram. I see we're just dropping Twitter completely.
Well, first of all, it's technically called X now, which feels weird to me because we're still talking about tweeting on X.
Especially since the domain name that I go to if I want to look at that site is twitter.com.
There's also the fact that they broke embeds, so you can't link to things anymore. You have to use a third-party embed linking website.
Yeah, it is. The year-long decline of Twitter is just a masterclass in the poor business skills of Elon Musk. It's very easy to be successful when you have a family fortune behind you, but first of all, to overpay severely for a business that has embedded itself in the culture, tweet became a part of the average lexicon of everybody, and you would decide to get away from that kind of free publicity for your product just baked in. That would be like if Kleenex changed their brand name right now.
Or like Band-Aid.
Yeah, it's just so stupid. So yeah, and that, setting aside all the other things that he's doing with the company, it's just monumentally stupid.
Yeah, it's pretty dumb.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a tear that we got on too early. And we shall never mention Twitter again.
I wouldn't make that kind of promise, but it'll be more rare than it used to be.
Uh-huh.
So today, I believe we even teased this. I was about to say toes, and I was like, that's not how the past tense of tease goes.
Yeah, don't tease me, bro.
I believe we teased this in our episode 2 weeks ago, but today we're going to be talking about Planescape Adventures in the Multiverse.
Yeah, because we've decided that we're not going to chase this idea of being like news breakers and news givers and anything. So that's why we're reviewing it a month after it came out. But it's fine. It's just fine.
Look, if people want the latest and greatest cutting edge news about Dungeons and Dragons stuff that's coming out, they've come to the wrong show. And I'm so sorry that we misled them.
I will say, if you want to find the latest and greatest Dungeons and Dragons news, do yourself a favor and just Google the name J.R. Zambrano. Is that what it is? He works for like bellooflostsouls.net or one of those sites, and he's always on top of everything.
I'm fairly certain his day job is being on top of those things.
Yeah, exactly. It makes it really easy when you get paid to do that kind of stuff to the exclusion of other stuff you have to do in your life. Yeah, J.R. Zambrano, Bell of Lost Souls. He's a staff writer over there. Follow him if you wanna get up to the minute stuff.
Oh man, his Twitter handle is J.R. Armagander.
Is that the same guy?
I think so.
Because okay, yeah, it is the same guy.
It's the same guy.
The tweet that was highlighted. See, we're breaking our Twitter embargo. The tweet that was highlighted on the Google landing page has him like quoting a property development CEO. So that's what threw me.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk Planescape. We're a few weeks behind its actual release, but that gave us time to really pore over things and read them thoroughly, or it would have if both of us had free time.
I felt like I gave it a pretty thorough read.
I know I read through it. I'm not going to pretend that I did a super thorough job.
With Wizards having, the print and the digital options, it seems like for you, they really need to just make an audiobook option. On your ridiculous commute, you could listen to all these books.
Yeah, hit me on my 2.5 hours of driving I do generally 5 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a reason why I listen to so many podcasts.
I would love it if they did these in audiobook. Like you open up Audible and you've got like Audible has those chapter markers and stuff on it, but there's like 10,000 of them for like every little header that's in the book, and you skip to it.
Oh God, just individual monster blocks.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. It sounds like a nightmare. So Planescape. This came out, what was it? Was it 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago? As of recording.
I think it's like 4 weeks ago tomorrow. Okay. As of recording.
Mm-hmm. Which recording isn't getting released for 12 days. So
right.
We're again, much like I said last time, we're actually back on schedule, folks. It's wild.
Yeah, it's very comforting and nice.
It feels so good. And to know that we're giving Scott audio far enough in advance that we can be like, yeah, you got time to work on this. Like, so wonderful. So this is a complete remaster of the original Planescape setting guide, right? Mm-hmm. From 1994.
Correct.
And it's got 3 books and a beautiful DM screen that all come as part of the box set. We're looking at what is it? It's 94 for the digital and physical bundle, 80 for just the physical.
Right. And it comes in that sleeve too, so it's getting the Spelljammer treatment, which I've had opinions on in the past. Like all in all, I'm pro them releasing these campaign settings in sort of a multi-book fashion, because my biggest criticism was like Curse of Strahd didn't feel special when it came out in a single box or a single book for 5th edition. So I'm glad that they're doing that. But you know, as always, sort of the neckbeard in me is always going to be wishing for the original boxed sets like you would get in the 90s. And speaking of, since you brought up the price of the books, I got curious about this today when we were getting ready to record, so I looked it up. So I have a Forgotten Realms box set that I keep on my bookshelf behind me, and I was trying to remember what the MSRP on it was, and I thought it was like $30, so I pulled it out. I looked on the back. Sure enough, US MSRP for it was $30. I was betting sort of dollars to donuts on that was going to be the same for the Planescape box set that came out in 94. This came out in 93. So found an old review of it that listed the MSRP because I couldn't find a high enough resolution picture of the box set because it's 30 years old, and it was also $30. So I ran it through an inflation calculator just to see sort of how much we're paying for this stuff now. So $30 in 1994 has the same buying power in 2023 as $62.37. So it's the money is like halved in value basically. And so for the print version of this, we're being charged $80. And I guess that's just MSRP. So it could be marked up further if you bought it somewhere else. And that also, obviously, none of this includes tax or anything like that. So $80. So that $30 in 1994 would be $62.37 today. So $80 minus $62.37. After you adjust for inflation, this costs about $17.63 more than what the original Planescape box set did. That's almost a 30% increase in costs after you adjust for inflation. And I was complaining about that before we started recording, and you raised a couple of good points, which I tend to agree with, that the art for a lot of those was black and white back 30 years ago. There was no shading to be had except for some special splash pages and things like that. And with those box sets, everything was soft cover. You might have a really nice sort of vinylish soft cover on one of them, and then the others maybe lesser so, but it was all saddle stitched and everything. So now we get 3 hardbound books with full color, and probably, as you said, the artists are getting paid a lot more than maybe what they were paid 30 years ago, which is fair. So at least there's an easy explanation for an almost 30% cost increase after inflation. I guess you just have to decide what you value, right? Because like I'm sure there are some people who are like, I just want the information. I just want to be able to use the setting. I don't need all the bells and whistles. Just give it to me in a stripped down PDF, which Wizards will never do. PDF stripped down or otherwise, they'll never give it to you in a PDF. But I just thought that was interesting. The sort of adjusted cost increase on that. And if you really like books as a sensual object, then maybe paying almost $20 more for it than you would have 30 years ago is worth it to you. I don't have necessarily an opinion on it other than I don't like it when things cost more.
I mean, that's fair. I will point out, if we're talking about 30 years ago money, we're talking about $8.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
It'd be the difference between a $30 box set and a $38 box set.
But we don't live 30 years ago. We live now.
We don't.
we live do. Now.
And a lot of people who love Dungeons and Dragons are working minimum wage jobs, which last I checked, the dollar value has not kept up with inflation since the 60s?
Something like that. So... yeah, I saw a story about that not too long ago where somebody was just doing like an annual analysis on it, but I can't remember the figures, of course, because they would be helpful to me right now. So, but yeah, when I was writing the newsletter for last month, I think I was messaging you when I was going through the Wizards of the Coast like quarterly call statement. So it was end of Q3 and they were doing it in like the first month of Q4. So they were doing a lot of their wrap up stuff for the year and doing some projections into 2024. And I was like, wow, we should do like more episodes that involve this stuff, because it was just talking about how like Wizards and D&D and Magic especially has just been carrying Hasbro for because they had like a pretty shitty year otherwise. But that stuff is just fascinating to me, because there's a lot more context and a lot more facets to what goes on other than just like, oh, they put out a new setting guide, or this book is overpriced and kind of lame. Like it's just interesting, all the interplay with the Hasbro and all its subsidiaries and everything, and how that affects decisions that are made for D&D that we can complain about on our podcasts.
I do think you and I are more likely to read something like that and parse it out into language that makes sense, instead of telling people like, oh, go check out the news articles, which are going to be kind of dry, kind of hard to read.
Yeah. Yeah. Most business journalism is not written for easy understanding.
Or for excitement.
Yeah.
Like the only excitement they get is red line go up.
Or line is no longer red, now is black.
Oh, black line, very good. So Planescape.
Yes.
How are we feeling about multiverses, kind of in general?
So I this was not something I came into this review thinking. It was when I was just sort of putting my thoughts together before we started recording, and I was rereading like the first like the intro. Because like Josh and I, because it's 3 books, Josh and I decided to split the work up a little bit. So I took a look at Sigil in the Outlands, which is just sort of the overall setting book. And you did the campaign book and the bestiary.
Yeah. Turn of Fortune's Wheel is the campaign book. And then the bestiary is Morte's Planar Parade.
Okay. And so I'm going back through the overall setting guide, and it starts talking about like, what is Planescape? Because obviously like some people need to be reintroduced to Planescape. I think the last I'm perfectly prepared for somebody to tell me that I'm wrong, but I feel like the last like big Planescape thing that came out was like Planescape Torment or its sequel. And that was in like the 2000s somewhere, like but sometime between 2000 and 2010. And I can't be any more specific than that. But I can see Josh looking intently at the camera, so that means he's looking at his monitor, so that means he's looking this up.
I had the Wikipedia still open.
Yeah.
So I was like, I have the answers in front of me. I just need to scroll to the right part of the page to see it. The game Planescape Torment came out in 2009 and was released as a download. Wait,
that can't be right.
Oh, sorry. I'm misreading this. It ceased being in print on DVD in 2009.
That does make sense.
was released as a downloadable on Good Old Games in 2010.
I feel like it may have come out in 99 because I remember buying
it. Was released in 99.
Okay, because I remember buying it in a Walmart in 2001 for and I bought the Game of the Year edition or something like that for like $15. But anyway,
the last book was 98 and it was Faction War.
Okay. So yeah, I feel like not a lot of Planescape has come out in the last 20 years. So obviously people need to be reintroduced to the idea of Planescape. It's easy for me or anybody of my ilk who's been sort of vaguely involved in Dungeons and Dragons for, since the 90s to know what it is. But it just goes into explaining it as like, oh, it's, the crossroads of all the planes and everything, not just the material planes, but all the other ones that are, because the material plane is basically like your Faerunes and such. It's like stuff that you are familiar with if you think about like Elves in the Forest tabletop role-playing games. But then you get all this crazy stuff. And I am wondering, like, is Planescape necessary as a concept in sort of a post-MCU pop culture space, where in the last several years, the idea of the multiverse has really sort of suffused the zeitgeist. There's like, nobody needs an explanation for what a multiverse is anymore, right? So does Dungeons and Dragons need its own sort of multiversal architecture, as opposed to, can people just like, would we have been fine with people just sort of inventing their own stuff? Or is it still useful to have something like Planescape, which is a touchstone creating sort of the multiversal rules for Dungeons and Dragons? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you mean. I think for me, the concept of Planescape involves multiversal travel, but is much more focused on the like elemental aspects of things, the alignment aspects of things, like heaven and hell, the land of the dryad, like that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. To me, on what I remember of Planescape before this release and based on this release, it seems less like, your Rick and Morty, where it's like, oh, there's infinite iterations of you and your family over infinite universes that you can interact with, and more there's an infinite variety to the types of worlds you can visit. Mm-hmm. Which, I don't know, it's similar but different to me.
Yeah, and I'm not saying this is really like a necessary question. Like, I don't even necessarily believe this. I just think it's interesting how the culture has shifted to much more of an awareness of, let's call it, just possibilities that multiverses raise in that kind of situation. So, I mean, is it necessary? Well, if Wizards wanted to meet their goals this quarter, yes. But conceptually, I wonder if it would have been better. And this is, and you can anybody can pillory me for this all they want, because I'm fully aware of what I've said in the past. Was it a good idea to resurrect Planescape? Or could they have interpreted it much differently? Obviously, they're not going to, let's be realistic, they're not going to not use the name Planescape just because it has too much cachet and marketability, right? But does it have to be Zeb Cook's Planescape? Could they not have come up with something very different and given us something very new, like a whole new interpretation of what their multiverse and sigil and everything is?
I think if I was operating at a high level in Wizards of the Coast, mm-hmm. even if what I really wanted to do was something like Planescape, but kind of unique and different and its own thing, I think I'd still want to build that off of the platform that is Planescape. Mm-hmm. And here's why, is how many nerds have been clamoring for a Planescape re-release for modern systems for literal decades.
I would like to counter that with a question as well. How many nerds have been clamoring for a Dark Sun re-release for decades on modern systems?
Fair, but Dark Sun's a little bit more of a complex nut to crack, you know? That's the world is already not a bright, shiny, and cheerful place. I think Dark Sun is one of those systems that works best when people aren't already depressed.
So we can only re-release a modified Dark Sun in the boom times when there's no threat of recession and the unemployment rate is very low.
I mean, yeah, a little bit. Like, you think about when all of those post-apocalypse stories were coming out, like Mad Max and Dark Sun and like all of those sorts of things. It wasn't when we were in the middle of some of our worst financial crises.
Yeah. I mean, when Joe Donker released The End, that was in the 90s and sort of the boom Clinton economic years.
Yeah.
But yeah, all I'm saying is I've said many times that I appreciate big swings, whether or not they end up working out. And like doing what they did with this Planescape re-release, just talking about it from a content standpoint, was a very, very safe play.
I agree.
It was there's nothing. I think it's well done. Like, I'll just spoil sort of my thoughts on it. Like, I think it's very well done, but there's nothing that surprises me. There's nothing that really makes me go, oh wow, I can't believe they did that. That was pretty great. I would have. That's really why I'm saying, like, oh, it would have been nice if they'd taken Planescape and tried to give me like a little bit of a reinterpretation of it, not like an updated rehash, right? Like, let's talk about Frasier, for example. I've been trying to I've really been trying to enjoy the new Frasier series on Paramount Plus. I love Frasier as a character. I loved Frasier on Cheers. I loved all 11 seasons of Frasier. You know, I wish they had tried to do something a little new and different with it rather than trying to rehash it and make it a shadow of what it was. I still enjoy it, but it is nowhere near as good as I'm going to call it the original, even though Frasier, the series, is the second iteration of Frasier. The new Frasier is not as good. And I feel like this version of Planescape is just fine. It's just as good as the original. But should you ever settle for just as good?
Yeah, I wonder in part if the trouble that you're running into is that the stuff that would be new, interesting, fun, and kind of fascinating to explore is all in one of the books I got.
Maybe, but I'm trying to think of it from a bit more of a global perspective on it as well. Like, just what I've got in sort of the setting book, like, it's not telling me anything super different from what I would have expected, right? And right. I think it's sort of the same reason that I don't like the Beatles. And that's not to say that the Beatles didn't produce good music. It's just I never listened to the Beatles when I was growing up because my dad didn't listen to the Beatles. So by the time I actually sat down and listened to like the White Album and several others, I had already heard all the music that had been developed since the Beatles up until that time. So when I went back to listen to it, it felt very common because I'd already heard everything that evolved out of it. And that's sort of how I feel looking at this. It's like, played the original Planescape, was familiar with it. Wasn't my favorite setting. I didn't play it like all the time, but I was familiar enough with it. And I don't really feel like this is giving me conceptually anything new, or at least not much new.
It'd be like listening to Nirvana the first time after having already consumed the entire Limp Bizkit discography.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. In Utero cannot hold up to Chocolate Starfish.
I get what you're saying. I think I understand where you're coming from. I I think that's a bit of a tricky tightrope to walk, right? Because if you change stuff a lot, then the people who just wanted a remake are going to be mad that you changed stuff. Mm-hmm. If you change stuff not at all, then the people who want something new and fresh and interesting don't get anything new and fresh and interesting.
Right. And here's the key. Here's the key that I think sort of answers the issue. This wasn't made for me. I'm almost 42 years old. I've seen everything that D&D has had to offer since second edition was the active edition, right? They with fifth edition and now going into what they're not calling sixth edition, but that's what it's sort of evolving into, the next iteration of it. Like, it's not about satisfying the old fans, it's about capturing the new fans, and they're sitting on this treasure trove of IP that they can re-release to people who've never seen it before and treat it as new. Like, I'd do that if I was them. It's like, and here's another thing people get mad at me for, or some people at least. It's like, I didn't care for the Star Wars sequels. I thought Force Awakens was pretty good. Last Jedi was terrible. Rise of Skywalker, unfulfilling. But that's fine, because what I realized while I was watching those movies is it wasn't made for me. It was made for kids who'd never seen Star Wars in the theaters before, because before that, the last movie that came out was in 2005. The TV shows are there for me. Mandalorian, Ahsoka are there for me to further that kind of storyline. So I think that's, if you look at this, or you look at Spelljammer, or if they ever end up doing some sort of modified Dark Sun, if you look at it and be like, oh, well, like, this doesn't excite me, I mean, it's probably because it wasn't designed to excite you. And that's fine, because if you can show people something that's new to them and bring them into the hobby, into the experience, then that's great. Like, I'm probably not going to give you $80 for it, but I'm glad that somebody will, and it sparks their imagination. So that's, I think it's part of like growing up and maturing too, for that. And it's part of it that I don't think a lot of people realize all the time, is like, you do eventually age out of things, and it's okay to just be like, oh, well, like in the 90s, I watched Power Rangers all the time. Like, I'm still a fan of Power Rangers, but also, like, I don't sit down and watch episodes of Power Rangers because they are simplistic and repetitive, because that's what appeals to children. But I still enjoy, like, I still love the concept, and I love going back to it every now and again. But I've aged out of it, and that's fine, because, like, content doesn't exist to grow old with me.
Yeah, it is. I will say, the folks who are like, well, this isn't like it was when I was a kid. It's like, well, yeah, because it's for kids now, not for you, who is now like high 30s, low 40s, wherever we're at. Like,
there's no reason to insult people's IQs, Josh.
I was talking about ages. But like, yeah, like, you're going to age out of some stuff. The brand might stick around with that same age group because that's who they're able to appeal to. It's like all the people who are complaining about My Little Pony not being complex or adult enough. And it's like, yeah, it's a show for children.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing?
You were lucky that they were cool with the brony movement. Just take the win and stop complaining.
I think you're absolutely right. I think Planescape is designed for people who have not experienced Planescape before, and people who were like, I just want Planescape for 5e. Just give me Planescape for 5e. I would love that so much. Please, God. Mm-hmm. It is not for people who are like, I really enjoyed Planescape back in the day. I'm wondering what they could do with the franchise given 30 years.
Right.
Like, what sort of new and fascinating stuff are they going to come up with? I don't think, at the very least, I don't think the core rules are for that. The Fortune's Wheel adventure might be, and I'd be kind of intrigued to pass that book off to you, let you get a look through it, and maybe get a brief idea of your thoughts after that. Because I found the adventure book really compelling.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about it. You only sort of briefly touched on it before we were recording.
Well, you know me. If I start talking too much, then I'll be wasting that sweet, sweet content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard for me to fake reactions a second time.
We're not actors.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of the skills we have, acting is not among them.
We're no Critical Role over here.
I really enjoyed the adventure book. The monster manual is about what you'd expect for something like Planescape. It adds several varieties of monsters specific to regions that you're going to be exploring. I find that really helpful in some respects, because if you look at the SRD, or honestly, even if you go looking at Mordenkainen's, you don't have a lot of like celestial type monsters. There just aren't that many. There
wasn't a lot of that in the yeah, we're talking about the multiverse bestiary that came out, right?
Yeah. Mordenkainen's Tome of Beasts? No, Tome of Beasts is Cold World Press.
Yeah, you're mashing up two companies there. It was like Mordenkainen's Guide to the Multiverse. Yeah,
that might be right.
Yeah, because I remember a bunch of people that we know were like, I didn't realize it was a bestiary. If I'd known that, I wouldn't have bought it. Like they thought it was going to be like a Planescape Light or something.
Yeah. So there were, I think, 5 Celestials in the entirety of Mordenkainen's. There's another like 5 in this monster book alone. And if they continue expanding on Planescape, there's probably going to be more. So if this sells well, they will continue expanding, because that's how Wizards do.
Right.
The adventure itself, I have mixed feelings about the adventure itself. The little bits, the piece to piece where you're like exploring individual regions, you're having individual adventures, things like that, I find really fascinating and really fun. The world is really fascinating and really fun. You highlighted one of the rules of Planescape, and I grabbed one of the others. So there's these 2 heuristic rules for Planescape, one of which is the rule of 3s, where things tend to happen in 3s. There's also very early in the campaign, you enter a casino in Sigil, and there's a Gith gambler there who calls himself Rule of 3 and exclusively bets and plays in exponents of 3.
Yeah, I think the rule of 3s is an interesting flavor mechanic, because like that means that the party can do something, and then the GM has sort of carte blanche to be able to excuse 2 other things happening as a consequence of that. And they can happen very far apart in space and very far apart in time if necessary.
Well, that's so one of the things I did find fascinating is the campaign. You're basically these kind of multiversal glitched beings. So you wake up in a cold stone room with no idea how you got there and very little idea about who you are at all.
So the opening to Planescape Torment.
I'm not 100%, but I will take your word for it. And a big part of the adventure is finding out that you are multiversally glitched and trying to fix it.
Josh, do you know how you kill a glitch?
How do you kill a glitch?
You destroy their glylactory.
That's so dumb.
I thought of it earlier.
I don't know why I'm laughing so hard.
I thought of it an hour ago when you were describing that to me before we recorded, but I figured I'd save it for the recording.
Gosh dang it. So part of being multiversally glitched is that if you die, if your character dies, they can be glitch swapped with a different incarnation of that character. So it's the same person, same soul, but they could be a druid instead of a paladin or something like that.
Do they get 2 hearts in a phone booth?
Not quite. Because the way it's written, is using the rule of threes.
Mm-hmm.
So if you lose 3 of your incarnations, then it's new character time.
Okay.
But I kind of like that because you can be like, I really like the personality of this character, but I wonder what she'd be like as a ranger. You know?
Oh, no, the way to play that is to just make a random table for race and class. Like and just make more and more of it random, like subclass and stuff too. Like just go full Doctor Who with it. You don't know what you're going to get.
I mean, they do in the intro to the book, they're like, if you want it to be more random, then wait until the first person dies, and then everybody writes their second incarnation at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you want it to be a little more planned and controlled, then have everybody write all 3 of their incarnations during session 0, which I was like,
no.
Writing one character sheet is challenging enough for me. Writing 3 in a sitting? Yeah.
I know some people don't, that myself included, do not deal well with like the anxiety generated by unexpectedness. So I can get why some people would really want to be able to like plan that out. I just think in that instance, like if you've got the mechanic, just run the full distance with it and just see, life is like a box of chocolates. Like see where that gets you.
I mean, you could also, if you are not someone who handles that sort of situation well, mm-hmm. then maybe your incarnation doesn't pop up until the end of the thing that killed you. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can have a breather, or you can do the poltergeist thing I sometimes do at my tables when someone dies 30 minutes into a 2-hour session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, your regeneration is it's having trouble. It's going to take longer.
It's processing all of the bits and boops.
Mm-hmm.
Another rule of the universe is the unity of rings, mm-hmm. where things in the planar multiverse have a tendency to come back around to where they started. This is explained at the top by it's a curved universe that extends to infinity, but you always return to your starting point given enough time.
Yeah, it's like the whole theory of a curved universe. Like if space-time is 4-dimensionally curved, then if you set off in one direction over a given period of time, you will return to where you started, like an ant crawling on top of a balloon. It just may be longer than the age of the universe, given universal expansion. And you'd have to be traveling much faster than light. But yeah. And I like, I like that when you're dealing with something like multiversal, because you just keep going further and further and further out. And like, it's interesting to think about, like, you're also getting closer and closer and closer to where you were.
Yeah. Well, and it makes it easier to go, oh, you're exploring in this region, you're hopelessly lost, mm-hmm. you're really confused about where you've been and where you're going. Oh, you're back at the start.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I found that to be particularly fascinating, that there's like these rules that kind of govern play a little bit, mm-hmm. because they're just like universal effects that are mm-hmm. part of playing in this space.
And we talked about this a little bit before we started recording too, but it was very weird how, like, in a couple of the different books, they call out, like, there are 3 fundamental rules of the universe. Here's one of them. And it just doesn't group all of them together. And you have to just go all over the place looking for it. And I'm like, it must not be that fundamental if you can't put it in a bulleted list for me here.
I will add that the third rule is one that you and I probably won't discuss at length, because both of us think it's silly, which is the center of all, which is that wherever you are is the center of the multiverse according to you. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, yeah, the center of the observable universe from a place you stand is where you stand.
Yeah, it's like very anthropocentric.
That's fine, sure, whatever.
Yeah. and getting like, just I can knock out a few things really quick, just overall about the setting. So Sigil, the great city at the center, it's at the top of the spire. It exists on the surface of a torus. So it's almost like if you're inside an O'Neill cylinder or something like that, and like you look up, you can see the other side of the city over there. And it's very kind of like vaguely fourth dimensional in the way it's described, because like there's no sun, there's no moon, but there is a 24-hour day-night cycle. There's no stars. Light just happens. And their version of noon is called peak, and their version of midnight is called anti-peak. So those are the brightest and the darkest times. And if you look up, you generally just sort of can see like a haze, or depending on the time of day, you might be able to see some sort of stretched version of the other side of the city. It's trying to achieve like a weird description of your perception while being limited to describing something beyond three-dimensional perception only with words. But I think I sort of get what it's getting at. And so then you've got sort of the whole central plane around which, like in the center of which is the spire. And then it's surrounded by all these different towns, basically. And it's, in my notes, I described it as demi-planes of dread with an extra planar coat of paint, because when the Demi-Planes book came out a few years ago, it was like, oh, here's the circus demi-plane, and here's the Egyptian demi-plane, which is no different really than the Ravenloft stuff that came out, back in the day. But it's just it's thematic and homogenous gate towns, like they're like worlds within a world. It's like how every alien world in Star Trek is represented by one culture and one people. Like in the dump, it's like this rusty metal place full of like metal machines and things like that. Automata, it's full of like robots and modrons. Glorium, full of giants. Excelsior, full of celestials. Sylvania, full of fae. Plaguemort, full of demons. And Plaguemort, by the way, sounds like the name of a place from a Terry Pratchett book.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So that, and there again, we get back into what I was saying of like, it's all good. There's nothing wrong with it. It just didn't surprise me at all. With the way they handle things there. And then go ahead.
There's one town in particular that's mentioned in the adventure, Faunel.
Mm-hmm. I remember seeing that in the book,
which I found fascinating because it's supposed to be like a jungle town.
Mm-hmm.
And they specifically I'll just read this verbatim. It's one of the, oh Lord, what is the name of the skulls? Mimirs.
Yeah.
One of the Mimirs for Faunel has a quote that goes, "Faunel's one of the wildest places in the Outlands. Most of the locals here are talking animals, but don't let yourself go primal. The last time things got too wild, the whole gate town tipped right into the Beastlands."
Oh yeah, that's what you were telling me about, how all the Outlands towns exist like just sort of on the threshold of the plane that they're associated with.
Yeah, which I find super compelling and fascinating, both from the stance of like, here is this almost like a way village before you jump into that whole dimension.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I think it was, who was it? It was Brennan Lee Mulligan was talking about this, where he's like, imagine being a town like Excelsior, where everyone's lawful good and everyone's really kind and polite and helpful to each other, except if they're too kind and polite and good to each other, then the whole town goes to heaven. So it's like a day a year, everybody has to line up and slap the mayor, and the mayor's like, no, you gotta hit me as hard as you can, because they'll know up there.
It's like all these towns exist orbiting a black hole, right? They're right on the event horizon, and they could just like fall into it.
Right. Oh, they even describe in Faunel, they're like, yeah, we have to be careful because the previous town fell into the Beastlands.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what?
Yeah. And so then, like, outside of all those towns, then you have all the other planes that are out there. And anybody watching on video can see I've got the Planescape map that came in the back of the book, sort of stretched out on my pinball machine over there. It's a fantastic little piece of art. The main focus of it really is the Spire and the Outlands. The whole other side of it is just a map of Sigil, so it doesn't really talk about any of the outer stuff all that much. But it's interesting to have as a reference.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of fascinating how they talk about, since it's not really 3D space, they're still going to use north, west, east, and south just to give you some kind of frame of reference. But they very specifically outline, and I suspect they did this in the setting guide book as well. These will not be polar magnetic directions.
Yeah.
These will be very strange and seemingly kind of random. And we're just giving you these so that you can make some sense of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the only compass that they mentioned is like a portal compass that can direct you to other portals. But I like talking about how I interpreted it as sort of like fourth dimensionality, like the sort of informal names for the directions that are orthogonal to like three-dimensional directions is like, we have like up, down, left, right, north, south, all this stuff. Then there's chalk and cheese because we have no concept for them. So you can't like one name is as good as another because there's we literally can't perceive what that direction would be. So that's how I interpreted some of that. It's like you might just end off going in some sort of fourth dimensional direction. And because really that's what like planar travel would be. It's like linking two three-dimensional locations together through the fourth dimension. So you might just accidentally slip through someplace.
A compass rose by any other name would smell as sweet.
A hyper rose. So then the book gives you two new backgrounds for your character. You've got the Gate Warden, and the best way I can explain that is like if Forgotten Realms character was like a modern day human living in the world today, then a Planescape character is like Star-Lord. It's like somebody who's been out there and seen everything, and like they can look at aliens and talk to them, doesn't phase them. It's basically somebody who's been to the planes, they've seen shit. But that's really the only difference. And then there's Planar Philosopher, which is I have determined is sort of a D&D equivalent of like Christian Gnostics who are searching for like the hidden truth of the world, like the true way. And they're motivated entirely by trying to like find those hidden truths about how the planes work and just how the multiverse works in concert. And I thought that was cool. The 12 factions, this is not new, but they all have different philosophies about how to live in the multiverse, how to navigate it, how it works. It talks about players being able to make their own faction, but you just have to have like a core philosophy that's based on sort of a presumed truth about the multiverse. You have to have a leader that embodies those beliefs, and your character doesn't really have to be that leader. And it may be better if your character is not that leader, but they have to be a person that you have to figure out. And then you have to have an HQ that's in Sigil or somewhere there. There's 5 new feats. There's a handful of new magical items like the Mimir, which is, if I don't think we clarified it, but it's a mechanical flying skull that functions as a library and repository of all information. So it's like a computer that flies around with you, basically. And then there's the good old Lady of Pain, which anybody who is familiar with Planescape will recognize, the sort of unknowable ruler of Sigil. She's like, her alignment is basically like cosmic neutral because she doesn't get involved in anything. She'll just float around the city with her attendants, and sometimes if you look at her wrong, she will punish you. And if you try to talk back to her or tell her that she's wrong, she'll often send you to the Labyrinth, which is essentially a series of streets and roads with like high walls that all interconnect and all lead nowhere. It's like the maze, and it's like back rooms, basically. You can just wander through there forever and die. But like if you cross her, she can instantly drop you to 1 HP. And if you cross her again, she can just send you to the maze. And the book even goes out of its way to talk about how she has no stat block because she is essentially beyond comprehension. And the party cannot, through any conventional means, even come close to the idea of destroying her.
You made me wonder. I didn't see her in the character.
Well, I mean, I just said
it. In the master blocks.
The book literally says she doesn't have one.
Well, I wanted to make sure that there wasn't something. And there is literally nothing.
Yeah.
It goes straight from Colurut to Malephant, which is like maelstrom and elephant combined.
And the book I have talks a lot about portal travel too. And it actually does describe portal travel kind of in sort of a Rick and Morty kind of way. The portals can go to different parts of the city, different planes, from Sigil to the Outlands. It can go anywhere. You have to have like a physical anchor for one end of the portal, and you can make your own. There's a really cool D100 table that's in there that helps you sort of randomly generate them. With where they lead and all that stuff. And the portals also have quirks, so think of it like exhaustion levels, I guess, for a portal, because like you can have a taxing portal, and that really is a struggle to get through, and you're not going to come out totally rosy on the other side. There's a tumbler lock portal, which needs a different key to open it every time. And there's a shifting portal, which, as you might expect, perhaps doesn't have the most consistent locations of output. But you can, like, there are ways you can go about creating them, and you have to maintain them and stuff, and you have to like have a key for some of them. And I think that's cool. I think it's nice to have some versatility, so it's not just like, okay, I'm just going to make this portal and walk through it and get where I need to go. Like, it would be great if like there was, and I guess you could do this really easily, but like every portal you create has, some chance, and you just roll on it, of being like one of these ones that has problems.
You were talking a little bit about the portals, Sigil, because Sigil is like a center, like a hub for all of this portal travel. It ends up with this sort of like big city melting pot vibe, kind of like they describe in Radiant Citadel, but I would say like even larger city.
Yeah,
like it's supposed to be pretty massive, as I understand it.
Yeah, and that's really interesting to me. Because I've sort of had this in the back of my head. It's like Radiant Citadel. It's interesting that book exists, because clearly at the time that came out, they knew they were going to be doing Planescape, and the concept is just so similar, right?
Well,
on a smaller scale. And I know part of the reason that they did Radiant Citadel was to address other criticisms that they had in their content, so that I'm sure played into it as well. But it's just interesting that two books that are so sort of thematically / mechanically connected came out in such a short period of time.
I mean, if you think about it from a marketing standpoint, then what Radiant Citadel was sort of the vanguard for this. They released Radiant Citadel to see what kind of hype would get built. Spelljammer, I think, was the much more obvious, like, we're going to be doing things with the Planescape. But Radiant Citadel, that came out shortly before Spelljammer, as I recall.
It was like a year and a half, 2 years ago that came out. Because that was before I moved, and I moved just over a year ago.
Yeah. So the Radiant Citadel coming out, I think, was kind of Wizards putting their big toe in the water. And determining whether or not it was the right time to finalize the work that they've been doing on Planescape. Because I think they've been playing with the idea of Planescape for a while.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if they hadn't, like let's say, 5e came out in 2014, I would say by like 2018, like it was the 800-pound gorilla that it is now, right? So like they knew it was on a roll, and then COVID only accelerated that. So yeah, if they hadn't been thinking about sort of the timing of a Planescape release, since then, it would be really foolish. So they have to have been thinking of it for at least 5 years.
Yeah. And I think what they did was they released Radiant Citadel specifically to address some of the more like writer-based concerns that people had been pressing on them, but additionally to go, are we ready for a Planescape release? If we release Planescape right now, it's going to be expensive for us to finish it.
Right.
And it's going to be expensive for us to get these box sets out. We can release a single setting guide adventure book and see how that does, and then use that to determine whether the time is right. And I think it did well enough that they were like, yeah, let's pull this lever.
Yeah. That's probably a pretty reasonable way to look at it. I had just thought of that as we were talking about this. Because there again, like, I think from a conceptual standpoint, Radiant Citadel was nothing that really like deviated from the norm of what you would expect from sort of a D&D multiversal kind of book. It didn't go. If anything, it went less weird than Planescape. It went significantly less weird than Planescape. But Planescape was just the weird that we expected, rather than a weird that could have been.
Fair. I think it's really just that sort of tester strip to see if everything's going to work, and it did. And here we are. In the adventure book, as you get out into the Outlands, obviously you're going to be exploring these gate towns. That's a big part of the campaign, is exploring these gate towns. The whole adventure goes from level 3 to level 17, I think I recall.
Really? That's a weird spread.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm just double checking. Yes. The final chapter you are level 17 for. So it is a big span of adventure. And I think part of the reason for that is they expect the characters to be fairly self-contained. This is not built to be something that you insert into your campaign you are already running and then you go off to other adventures. This is really meant to be, you create the characters for this adventure, they grow up through this adventure, and then once it's over, you retire them, is my expectation. When you're in the Outlands, they've got a few additional like random encounter type things that you can do. One of which I was really excited about because it's called Angels in the Outlands.
Yeah.
And it's about an army of angels and demons that every so often have a mock battle via a game called Spireball. And you're allowed to side with either of those groups to push the flow of things one way or another. Which, so good.
Yeah, I very much enjoy baseball as a conflict resolution mechanic in fiction. Prime examples are in Die Ranger, one of my favorite Super Sentai series, which came right after Zhu Ranger, which was adapted into Power Rangers. There is a loose trilogy of the Die Rangers having to compete against some of the villains in various sports like soccer and baseball. So there's like a baseball episode and there's a soccer episode. And then, of course, there's the classic Deep Space Nine episode, Take Me Out to the Holosuite, where a Vulcan captain challenges Cisco to a baseball game because he dislikes Cisco and he wants to humble him by beating him at his game. And so Cisco makes the entire command crew of Deep Space Nine play on his baseball team to defeat the Vulcans.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's so good. So there's a little of that in here as well, if you should choose to include it. These are optional encounters. Another one, which this seems a little less optional, is the Renis Nupra, which is an adult time dragon, who encounters the party kind of out of sequence. And so it's a little bit like the Doctor Who River Song romance.
Spoiler.
Where there's confusion about when and how they're meeting each other. they both seem to know more about each other than the other does at times. So I was like, that's honestly, if you're going to be doing a setting like this, that is a fun thing to include. There's a whole zone that's called, what is it? It's chronosepsis. It's probably not chronosepsis. That sounds like a disease, a time disease,
a time infection. I'm gonna write that down.
Time infection?
No, chronosepsis.
It is the mausoleum of Chronepsis, and it is a time-based area where dragons from across the plains come to seek to learn the secrets of fate, which is pretty fascinating. I don't want to get into too much detail on any of this stuff because I know players listen to our show just as much as GMs do.
Right.
And that is the one big complaint that I have about this, is that there is some of the writing is, to me, at the very least, kind of predictable.
Mm-hmm.
Like the way certain adventures are going to go, the sorts of like, oh, it starts out looking like this, but then, it's actually like this. Like those sorts of things. I was like, I started reading the adventure and I'm like, I bet this. And then I was right. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's just because I'm so deeply entrenched in GM brain. Hopefully folks' experience with it at a table is different. And they're like, oh my God, I never saw that coming.
It's called genre savvy.
That may be the whole issue, but there were multiple occasions where I was like, I bet they're going to do this thing. And then they did. And I was like, called it again.
Yeah. I want to mention the credits that were in the front of the book. We've talked a lot about being big fans of some of like Zeb Cook's work back in the 80s and 90s, setting aside the Conan the Barbarian book that he was probably forced to do at gunpoint. But I thought it was interesting that it talks about credits and it says special thanks to the original setting designers. And it's like, Monty Cook, Wolfgang Bauer, names that everybody knows. And it like takes a few minutes before, I think Wolfgang Bauer actually came after Zeb Cook, but it takes a few minutes to get to Zeb Cook, which is kind of surprising because as the legend goes, like Zeb Cook came up with Planescape. He was the lead designer on it. He wrote the whole thing. Like, somebody in the office like tasked him with coming up with a setting based on like the Planar handbook. And he's like, yeah, okay, let me fool with it for a couple months. And then he came up with Planescape at that point. So it's kind of weird and a little disappointing that Zeb's not getting the recognition that I feel like, is probably owed to him on that. But, it also doesn't surprise me, I guess, because like, once again, we're in a situation where like somebody who's like 17 and getting this has no idea who Zeb Cook, who was born in 1934, is, or anything that he's ever done. Like, the man's 89 years old. I mentioned to you earlier today that it was wild looking at his Wikipedia page, because if you look at the photo of him on there, it was taken in 2016. So he would have been like 84, I think, something like that, 83. And he looks like a man in his mid 60s. I mean, it's just wild. Like, Zeb Cook has a phylactery. Like, he is very well preserved.
Sitting on a philosopher's stone.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he could look much different than he did in 2016 at this point, but still.
I also, speaking of folks who were involved in the original Planescape that deserve thanks for what we've currently been looking at, Tony DiTerlizzi, which I hope I pronounced well. I read the phonetic pronunciation off his FAQ on his website. So,
DiTerlizzi sounds like a German man, like a German whose father was Italian.
It's DiTerlizzi. It's not DiTerlizzi. It's DiTerlizzi. But he did a lot of the cover art both for the original Planescape and for this new version. And he also did all of the art for the GM screen, which is
gorgeous GM screen.
One of my favorite pieces out of the entire box set is how gorgeous this GM screen is. I think I might actually use this at games.
Yeah, I've got the Spelljammer set behind me, and the GM screen that you got with that one is way cooler than the one that came with Spelljammer, I think.
I like it a lot. It's beautiful. But that was one of those things where we were literally looking it up right before recording, where I was like, why does this name seem familiar? And it's like, oh, he did the art for the original Planescape. That's why. That's why his name seems familiar.
Yeah, these Lady of Pain drawings come with a pedigree in the updated one.
Yeah,
that's cool. It's always cool to see like old artists come back. Like I know there have been some situations where we've looked at some of these books and things and realized it was an artist that, you know, or maybe they did Magic cards in the 90s or something, or they worked on some of the some original art for some of the second or third or fourth edition stuff. It's always cool to see that they bring those kind of people back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you've got talented artists who've done work with you before, it's kind of like known quantities on both sides of the table, right?
Right.
It's an ideal scenario.
Right. So is there anything left about the two books that you looked at that you really need to get off your chest?
I don't think so. I think I don't want to get too much into what kinds of monster blocks there are in there. I will say I saw some abilities on some of these monsters that I was like, ooh. But I don't want to spoil things for people who are going to play, because if they see that monster and they're like, I've listened to Goblins and Growlers, I know what's coming next.
Yeah.
Then their GM's going to be mad at me specifically. And I don't want that. The art's gorgeous. The monster blocks are nice and varied, which is always fantastic. I did notice they have a lot of alignments still, but they say typically lawful good, typically chaotic evil. And I'm like, just get rid of the freaking like, look at the large red demon creature and look at the context that the party's meeting them in and go, this is how this creature is going to behave.
Yeah. It feels like in trying to avoid stereotyping, they have gone harder on stereotyping by adding the word typically in there.
Yeah, it's keeping to type. They're like this. And it's like, that's the whole problem. Stop it. Yeah. But overall, I really liked what I read. I really enjoyed, though I felt like the adventures, I was predicting the next turn before it was happening. The world and the way it's portrayed is really fun. There's a lot of really fascinating stuff to explore. There's a lot of really fun stuff to explore. It gives you some flexibility as far as how you get places and what you do once you get there. And I saw multiple points where they encouraged failing forward. Like if you go into Excelsior, a town that is lawful good and full of lawful good celestial, typically full of lawful good celestial beings, typically, and you start doing a bunch of crime, then the primary NPC who's showing you around is like, you know what? Here's your payment. Please leave. Which, like, that makes sense for the scenario, but it's fun to see that be the case, because I know I've read one too many modules where it's like, oh, well, if the party's not going to behave themselves in front of the major domo, then they're going to get kicked out of the Duke's castle. And it's like, well, how does the adventure proceed from there? It doesn't. They have to go do a different adventure. And it's like, what? Why would you write it this way? Why would you set it up so that there's like one way in and the GM has to figure out anything else?
It's just, differences in writing styles, I guess.
I guess
my biggest takeaway from Planescape is, and maybe I'm not looking at it correctly, but it feels like something that is harder to use as a sandbox setting.
It
Because
does feel like they fleshed a lot out.
yeah, I'm just thinking like, Forgotten Realms, Faerun, like, of course that's a sandbox setting because Wizards has treated it as the only setting for so long. Strahd, not a really good sandbox setting, very prescribed series of events that goes on there. Spelljammer, I feel like opening yourself up to sort of the crystal spheres and all that stuff, you can very easily adapt that into a sandbox where you can just drop in your own homebrew stuff, and follow some threads and things, especially if you're like on the Spelljammer. Planescape, it feels more like an event rather than a steady state, Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. And I don't think the adventure book does a whole lot to discourage that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the creatives among us will find ways to rip components out of this and use them in a variety of ways that are fun. But I absolutely see what you're saying, and I'm inclined to kind of agree. This is built to be less of a setting guide and more of an adventure.
Yeah, I mean, and like going back to Curse of Strahd for a second, like that didn't even become kind of a setting guide until they released that supplemental Demi-Planes book, which happened years later.
Right.
And even then, it's still probably a little difficult to play that as a sandbox rather than just like, here's some one-offs that we can go through and I will loosely thread them together or something. So yeah, I don't even know if this is a criticism. It's just an observation.
I think that's a fair observation. So I think for final thoughts, how do you feel about having spent $80 on this?
Well, I want my $17.62 or however back. Wizards of the Coast. I mean, I'll be very honest. I enjoy it. I'm glad it exists. I think they did for what their goal was. I think they did a very good job with it. I probably won't end up playing it much or at all, and that's probably because I don't think it works really well as a sandbox. Because I can spend all day shitting on the Forgotten Realms because they overuse it, they rely on it too much, and they've made it familiar, and familiarity breeds contempt. But at the end of the day, if I want to just like drop my Faerun map down on a table and just like throw it or throw a dart at it or something, like if it hits the Dale lands, I can run an adventure in the Dale lands. If it hits like the Zentrum Tower, I can have something going on with the Zentrum or something like that. There's a lot of options with that, and maybe I just don't have enough familiarity just yet with this sort of new iteration. But again, it feels very prescribed what you're supposed to do.
I think if we're fortunate, they will see the popularity of this, because I've heard of a lot of people picking up this set of books. And then next thing they'll do is they'll release a setting guide for it.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And it doesn't even have to be anything crazy. Like I would even take one of the old like 40 or 50 pagers that they softbound that just, had like several threads for adventures and flesh them out a little bit.
Yeah, I could see that being really good.
Yeah.
For my part, just for the monster book and the DM screen, that's like half or even like 2/3 of the value right there for me.
Yeah,
they are
you're
wonderful.
Right about that. You're right about that. Speaking as somebody who for a long time just used a 3-ring binder as my DM screen, it's very nice to have something made for the purpose and looks really good and looks really pro.
Oh, gorgeous.
I would maybe that's my $17.60. Maybe it was for a nice DM screen.
That's all it was. Just that for a nice DM screen. Yeah. I think I am getting my $80 worth out of this set of books. Now, I would still like to see a setting guide, but we'll see. Maybe they'll bring us that.
Yeah, get on that, Jeremy. All right. Well, do we have? Oh wait, yeah. I guess we should ask people what they think. If you've picked up Planescape, you've had a month to take a look at it now. Like, if you think I'm an idiot, like, and I'm just not seeing the big picture here, I would love for you to come into the Discord and tell me that. Feel free, bit.ly/goblin discord, at Way of Brandalore, you're an idiot. If you have some very well-reasoned criticisms or well-reasoned opinions on your own supporting what we've said, even better. Just drop those in there as well.
Stop on by. Brandon mentioned earlier the newsletter. That's once a month.
Yep.
That's linktr.ee/goblins and growlers is our link tree. The newsletter sign up is right there. Right there. So easy to do.
If not at the top, very close to the top.
And it's always got a lot of good info, and it's once a month. So it's not like he's pestering you.
Yeah, exactly. I have no time or inclination to do it more than once a month.
You can find us on social media at Way of Brandalore or at Black Cloak DM, or where available at Goblins Growlers / at Goblins and Growlers, because in some places we lost the password to the and.
Can't remember which email address to use to recover it. It's a complex situation that's not imperative enough to address any limited mental energy to resolving. So there's that. Do we need to do any sponsorship promos or anything?
I don't think so. Though if we do, I'm going to end up stitching them on just like I did for Throne Exchange.
Let's just say we're doing that. Scott, leave this part in.
Well, hold on. This episode comes out on the 27th.
Yes.
So it will already be too late for anyone who's interested in doing Throne Exchange to join it, because we'll be in the gift selection period then.
Okay.
So I'm sorry that you missed it, but I'm sure we'll have other sponsors that you can do fun stuff with us regarding.
Yeah.
What I will say,
maybe we can put out a special Throne Exchange episode next week.
What I will say is that everybody should telephone, telegraph, tell a friend about the Goblins and Growlers podcast, because word of mouth is the way to be.
I agree. And as I often say, it is also the best Ludicrous album. I know we're very, very past Halloween by the time you read this, but I would also encourage everybody, if you haven't, to make sure to go back and listen to our actual play of The Machine, the indie journaling game. We put a lot of effort into that, and we're really proud of it. And even if you've listened to it, maybe listen to it again, or telephone, telegraph, tell a friend to listen to The Machine. And follow our link in that show note, and show the developers some love by buying their haunting journal game.
Oh, 100%. It's such a cool game, and I feel really good about how it came out. Not least of which Scott's beautiful editing on it. Thank you, Scott.
Absolutely. And also, we're still accepting rebuttals on more unpopular D&D opinions. If you have strong opinions on floor dice, feel free to share them. There are people who will be upset, and we live for that.
That best place for that is, as always, in the Discord. bit.ly/goblin discord.
In the Discord, or if you want to buy a billboard next to a major highway, you can also do that.
That'd be amazing.
Oh, it would. I don't want to spend any company money on that, though. I guess the only other thing I can think of is I'll be at PAX Unplugged the weekend after this comes out. Yeah, so me and Liz and Tess are going up there.
The second and third?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to be sure.
We're going up there to do some looky-looing and some networking and stuff like that. So it should be a good time. So if you're around there, come by and say hi. That's in Philadelphia, that first weekend in December. And that's all I got.
All
right. Well, everybody, thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with something that we have written on a spreadsheet somewhere that I cannot recall at the moment. But suffice it to say, we did plan it.
In fact, you know what? I know exactly what it is.
Okay, let's give them a taste.
We're going to talk about Cobalt Press, specifically the Black Flag Project and how that's going.
Yeah, Josh was over at the house a while back and we were talking about this, and both of us have opinions.
We have strong opinions.
Yeah, but not as strong as floor dice. That's a hill that some people will die on. Good night, Snapshot. And we'll talk to you all later.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.